December the 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. As the sun rose over Pearl Harbor, 353 Japanese aircraft descended upon the U.S. Pacific Fleet like a steel storm. In less than 2 hours, the attack was over. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, nearly 200 aircraft obliterated, over 2,400 Americans dead. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, reportedly said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." But there was something else the Japanese military leadership failed to understand that morning, something that would prove far more critical than the giant they'd awakened. They didn't sink America's repair crews. As Japanese pilots flew back to their carriers, celebrating what they believed was a devastating victory, they looked down at the carnage below. Burning ships, twisted metal, black smoke rising thousands of feet into the Hawaiian sky. To them, it looked like the end of American naval power in the Pacific. Their intelligence estimates suggested it would take years, perhaps even the entire duration of the war, for the United States to recover from such a blow. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong. What happened next would become one of the most remarkable displays of industrial determination, technical ingenuity, and sheer willpower in military history. It's a story that doesn't get told nearly enough. The story of how American repair crews turned what should have been a multi-year defeat into a months-long setback. When dawn broke on December 8th, the full scale of the disaster became clear. The USS Arizona was gone, a tomb for over 1,100 sailors, broken in half and settled on the harbor floor. The USS Oklahoma had capsized completely, her hull pointing toward the sky like a giant steel whale. The USS West Virginia, USS California, and USS Nevada were all sitting on the bottom, partially or completely submerged. According to standard military doctrine of the era, these ships were total losses. The accepted wisdom was that any battleship taking more than 3 or 4 torpedo hits was done for. Some of these vessels had taken 5, 6, even 9 torpedo strikes. By every conventional measure, they should have been written off and scrapped where they lay. But the U.S. Navy had something the Japanese planners hadn't fully accounted for. Salvage experts who refused to accept impossible as an answer. Within hours of the attack, even as fires still raged and rescue operations continued, naval constructor Captain Homer N. Wallen was already surveying the damage with an engineer's eye. Wallen had spent his career studying ship design, damage control, and salvage operations. Now, standing on the oil-slicked shores of Pearl Harbor, he was looking at what would become his masterpiece. Wallen's assessment was brutally honest, but unexpectedly optimistic. Yes, the damage was severe. Yes, some ships were beyond saving, but most of them could be brought back. Not eventually, not someday, soon. The first challenge was the USS Oklahoma, a 27,000-ton battleship lying completely upside down in the mud of Pearl Harbor, with over 400 men still trapped inside. Traditional salvage wisdom said you'd need to cut her up for scrap right where she sat. The American salvage team said they'd flip her back over. It sounds insane. It was insane. But over the next several months, crews accomplished something that had never been done before, on such a scale. They drove massive concrete anchors into the shore, 21 of them, each weighing hundreds of tons. They rigged heavy steel cables and installed enormous electric winches. Then, inch by painstaking inch, they rotated 27,000 tons of capsized battleship. It took 8 months. On June 16th, 1943, the Oklahoma's hull broke the surface and she rolled upright. While she would never fight again, the salvage operation proved something crucial. American repair crews could accomplish the supposedly impossible. But the Oklahoma was just the beginning. The USS California and USS West Virginia presented different challenges. Both had been torpedoed multiple times and had settled onto the harbor bottom. Conventional salvage would take years. The repair crews gave themselves months. They invented new techniques as they went. When they couldn't find existing equipment that could do the job, they built it. When standard procedures wouldn't work, they wrote new ones. These weren't just repair crews, they were innovators working under the most intense pressure imaginable. First, they had to seal the torpedo holes, not just patch them, but create watertight seals that could withstand the stress of pumping out thousands of tons of water. They used anything that would work: concrete, steel plates, underwater welding techniques that were barely proven. Divers worked in pitch-black water filled with oil and debris, sometimes having to cut through the ship's own structure just to reach the damaged areas. The USS West Virginia alone had taken 6 torpedo hits. She sat in 40 feet of water and mud. Standard naval engineering said she was done. But by May 1942, just 5 months after the attack, she was floating again. By July, she was in dry dock. By 1944, she was back in action, bombarding Japanese positions at Leyte Gulf. Think about that timeline. A battleship that had been sitting on the bottom of Pearl Harbor, written off by enemy intelligence as permanently destroyed, was back in the war less than 3 years later, raining 16-inch shells on the very nation that had sunk her. Here's what the Japanese attack planners missed. Pearl Harbor itself was the greatest asset that survived the attack. Unlike if the Pacific Fleet had been caught at sea and sunk in deep water, every ship that went down at Pearl Harbor was in relatively shallow water, close to shore, and most importantly, close to one of the most sophisticated naval repair facilities on Earth. Pearl Harbor's shipyards, machine shops, and dry docks were largely untouched. The Japanese pilots had focused on ships and aircraft. They'd largely ignored the fuel storage tanks that held millions of gallons of oil. They'd left the submarine base intact, and they'd left the repair infrastructure standing. This was Admiral Yamamoto's true nightmare scenario, though he might not have realized it at the time. Japan had just handed the United States Navy the perfect training ground for large-scale salvage operations, with all the tools needed to conduct them. But infrastructure alone doesn't raise ships. That requires people. And this is where the American repair crews truly shine. These were machinists from Detroit, welders from Pittsburgh, engineers from MIT and countless technical schools across the country. They came from shipyards in Virginia and California, bringing decades of industrial experience. Many were civilians who had never worn a uniform before Pearl Harbor. They worked around the clock. 16-hour shifts were common. 24-hour shifts weren't unusual when a critical operation was underway. They worked through tropical heat, sudden rainstorms, and the ever-present smell of oil and death that hung over the harbor for months. And they worked with an urgency born from the knowledge that every day a ship sat damaged was a day. The Japanese had an advantage in the Pacific. The speed of their work was unprecedented. The USS Pennsylvania, which had been in dry dock during the attack and suffered damage, was back in service in weeks. The USS Maryland, hit by 2 bombs, was operational again by February 1942, just 2 months after the attack. The USS Tennessee, trapped behind the capsized Oklahoma and damaged by bomb hits, was out of the harbor by December 20th and fully repaired by February. Japanese military intelligence continued to list these ships as destroyed or permanently disabled. Their battle plans for 1942 and 1943 were based on the assumption that America's Pacific battleship fleet was effectively non-existent. Then came the shock. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the Japanese combined fleet found itself facing battleships they thought they'd destroyed 3 years earlier. The West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, all sunk at Pearl Harbor, were now forming the battle line that would help destroy Japanese naval power forever. Imagine being a Japanese naval officer, looking through binoculars at ships you'd watched burn and sink, now steaming toward you with guns blazing. The psychological impact alone must have been devastating. The resurrection of the Pearl Harbor fleet sent a message that echoed far beyond simple military capability. It demonstrated something fundamental about American industrial culture that the Axis powers had underestimated: the ability to solve problems through innovation, determination, and sheer refusal to accept defeat. Japan's military strategy had been based on the belief that one decisive blow could knock America out of the Pacific long enough for Japan to consolidate its conquests. The speed of the Pearl Harbor recovery shattered that assumption completely. By mid-1942, less than a year after the attack, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was not only recovered, but growing. New ships were joining faster than Japan could possibly match. But more importantly, the ships they thought they'd eliminated were back, improved, modernized, and crewed by sailors with a very personal score to settle. The success at Pearl Harbor established protocols and techniques that would be used throughout the war. When ships were damaged at Guadalcanal, Midway, or any of the countless other Pacific battles, American repair crews could often get them back in action in days or weeks rather than months. The Japanese Navy had no equivalent capability. When they lost a carrier at Midway, it was gone forever. When the Americans lost the Yorktown at Coral Sea, so badly damaged that Japanese intelligence listed her as sunk, she was back at Midway just weeks later, having undergone repairs that should have taken months. This repair capability became a force multiplier that Japanese strategists had never adequately calculated. Every American ship was effectively worth more because it was more likely to survive damage and return to service. Of the 8 battleships damaged at Pearl Harbor, 6 returned to service. Only the Arizona and Oklahoma were total losses, and even the Oklahoma was raised and salvaged for parts. 3 destroyers, 3 light cruisers, and numerous other vessels were also salvaged and returned to the fleet. The Japanese had destroyed or damaged 21 ships. The Americans had 18 of them back in service within 2 years. Some, like the destroyers Cassin and Downs, were so thoroughly destroyed that only their machinery was salvaged. But even that machinery was placed in new hulls and sent back to war. Today, the USS Arizona Memorial stands over the remains of the battleship, a solemn reminder of the cost of unpreparedness and the sacrifice of those who died that morning. But the full story of Pearl Harbor includes what happened after the attack, the incredible story of the repair crews who refused to let that sacrifice be in vain. These weren't the men who stormed beaches or flew fighters. They were welders and pump operators, engineers and divers, planners and problem solvers. They worked in obscurity, rarely receiving the recognition given to combat forces. But their achievement was no less vital to victory. They proved that American industrial might wasn't just about building new ships. It was about the refusal to write off the old ones. It was about the ingenuity to find solutions where none existed. It was about the determination to turn disaster into opportunity. The Japanese military made many miscalculations in their decision to attack Pearl Harbor. They underestimated American resolve. They failed to destroy critical infrastructure. They brought a reluctant giant into the war. But perhaps their greatest miscalculation was assuming that the damage they'd inflicted was permanent. They sank the ships, but they didn't sink the spirit of the men who would raise them. And in the end, that made all the difference. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. These unsung heroes, the welders, engineers, and salvage crews, changed the course of history without ever firing a shot. If you believe these stories matter, if you think the next generation needs to hear about the courage and ingenuity that defined the greatest generation, then please subscribe and turn on notifications. We're on a mission to bring these forgotten chapters of World War II back into the light. And here's our question for you. Where are you watching from? Our community spans the entire globe, from Texas to Tennessee, from California to Carolina, from overseas bases to small-town America. You're not just a viewer. You're part of something bigger. You're helping keep these memories alive for future generations. Drop a comment below and tell us your city or state. Better yet, tell us if someone in your family served in World War II, whether they stormed beaches, flew missions, worked in factories, or served in any capacity. Every story matters. Every sacrifice counts. Thank you for watching, and thank you for honoring their memory.